You can see grief as like this terrible thing, and here I'm going to quote you on this from one of your things on 3x4 magazine. The Stranger, the Saint, and Grief's Goodness. It's a great quote. That we are drawn to aesthetic experiences involving emotional states that are otherwise painful or distressing cries out for explanation, and philosophers have proposed a number of solutions to this paradox. Yet there is another instance where we are drawn to emotionally painful experiences that has received far less philosophical attention and arguably poses even harder puzzles than the paradox of tragedy. The grief we typically feel upon the deaths of those we care about, depend on, or admire. So beautifully written, but like there's something to be said. Even in the worst cases, you have a nugget to do, and even in the best, you have to have that contrarian, like you said, mindset to not go full hog into optimism, etc.
Well, as I mentioned a while back, I think grief, it very much surprised me when I first started looking at this topic as a philosopher, because it's got a little bit of attention here and there in the history of philosophy, but it's not been, central, right? Within the history of philosophy. You can look through the works of, many historically prominent, influential philosophers and see not a word written about grief.
Right.
But that very much surprised me, because here you have, again, a kind of, I would say, near universal of the human condition, something that causes people distress, anxiety, etc. Surely philosophers should, have something useful to say about this, something insightful to say about this. And, so much to my surprise, they hadn't said much very systematic, a little here, a little there. So the book that I'm working on, which I anticipate should be published between maybe 12 and 18 months from now, will be sort of the first attempt that I'm aware of by a philosopher to kind of have a systematic philosophical account of grief. And the central problem that the book addresses is the problem that you were referencing in that quotation. I mean, here you have an experience that is, I think even when grief goes well, fairly emotionally harrowing for people, distressing for people. And yet, I think most of us understand or appreciate that this is not a feature of the human existence that we should want to get rid of.
Yes.
Right? And that's weird.
Yeah,
right?
I
mean, if I just sort
it's
of
a fundamental
if I just described grief, right? You imagine sort of the alien species, landing on Earth, and they say, "Hey, we've heard about this grief thing. What is that?" Well, if I just describe it to them, I think their reaction is likely to be, and people think they should do this.
Yeah, you're getting less of that, right? You're trying to do.
Right. I mean, what So you've got this set of emotions and affective states that in ordinary life we don't think are good. We try to avoid them. We think that something has gone wrong if we're experiencing these things. And yet in the case of grief, I think not merely do we suppose that we sort of have to put up with it, right? I think we tend to suppose that there's something substantial or significant about it as a kind of life experience, such that we wouldn't think human lives were better, right? If the grief was extracted out of them, right? We think there's something worse.
Yes.
Right? The question is, well, what is that? Right? What is it that grief provides us, or why should we think it's a worthwhile or can be a worthwhile experience, despite sort of on its surface looking quite terrible. I was recently writing about the grief of C.S. Lewis, right?
Oh yes,
the Christian writer known for the Chronicles of Narnia books to most, but he wrote this memoir, Grief Observed. Which was not published during his lifetime under his own name. It was only published under a pseudonym, interestingly. But, you read this book by, man of reason, right? C.S. Lewis, right? Dapper, Oxford, and you read this memoir where, I think he's being relatively unguarded. This guy is seriously troubled, almost like, I think some people say, cracking up, over his wife's death. And, you read this and still your reaction is, I don't think this experience is one that I would wish on people generally speaking, but it's important for him to have it. And so for me, the philosophical question or problem that I'm trying to address, I think throughout much of my work on grief is, well, how come?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What's the purpose or point, or what's the good of it? Another sort of illustration of this is from Camus, right? In the novel The Stranger.
Yes.
Meursault is this sort of character who can't grieve. And I think most of us, our reaction to Meursault, maybe we kind of admire when we're in our kind of, leather jacket existentialist mode. Here's this kind of independent figure who, it sort of floats above it all. But I think when we really look at him, we pity him.
Yeah.
Right? Because he can't grieve because he doesn't have the kinds of connections to other people that are preconditions of grieving them.
Yeah.
And that seems not to be a welcome feature of Marceau's life, but a great detriment.
Yeah, and then when you said, and you kind of brought in St. Augustine too, and that the stranger, the saint, and the grief's good. And so we'll kind of end with this quotation that you ended it on, which is another splendid thing: is when others die, we are brought face to face with the chilling reality that, as Ernest Becker put it, each of us, quote, is a small trembling animal who will someday decay and die. But so long as we survive, the grief that others' deaths produce need not be seen as an unmitigated bad. Despite being haunted by his grief, Augustine and us and everyone else is at least able to be invested in another such that another's death can be counted as a loss to him. Yeah. Like him, we ought to take grief as an opportunity afforded to socially interdependent, practically committed beings like ourselves. So beautiful that, again, someone's death is almost a lost potentiality of me, or what my life and experience could be, because they have not continued as such.
Yeah, and I think, we build lives for ourselves where certain things are, sort of taken for granted, right? And one of them is people, right? And, we build our sort of expectations about what our lives will look like and how they'll unfold around those other people. We know, right, that their existences are contingent, just as we know that our existences are contingent. But I think that a lot of what people experience in grief is, of course, sadness at the loss of this particular person, but they also, I think, feel a deep sense of disorientation.
Yes.
Right? That, as I put it a couple of times in things I've written, I think grief feels as much like a loss of self as a loss to self, right? It sort of feels like the world has been in some way upended for you.
Yeah, good point.
And I think that says something about the kinds of creatures we have to be, or the kinds of creatures that we are, such that, we can grieve, right? We don't just have relationships with others where, they're purely transactional, right? Where we get X from them and they get Y from us. I think we invest in them, right? Yeah. And we become emotionally and psychologically invested in them. And we, again, sort of build our self-conception or self-understanding around them. And when they die, that self-conception has to change somehow, right? It can't continue just as it did before.
No, that's totally right.
And I think the challenge of grief is to figure out, to put it in a kind of cliche way, but in a way that's nevertheless insightful, I think the challenge is to figure out how to go on.
Yeah, and my personal anecdote with that is I actually was very very fortunate of who it was and the family and how it all happened. But I actually lost one of my good friends, Jay Carousel, sophomore year of college. He came up from Hurricane Katrina, was a part of our friends group, and he passed away in a car accident. But at his funeral in New Orleans, his dad took us into a room, us 8 individuals, I guess you could say, guys, and he played us Don Henley's In a New York Minute. And he was just like, look, you guys love Jay, Jay, and so that grief was not, and it changed my aspect of death, and from literally that point on, it was a celebration of life. Mm-hmm. It was not a sitting there being, mad or sad that you're never going to experience that thing with that person again. But that's the importance of you having to do it now, then, in the present, and like you said, keep going on.
Yeah, I mean, the Becker quote that I referenced from what you read a moment ago, I mean, sure, we all are these small trembling animals. But here's the thing, I am that small trembling animal. And
we are here.
Well, but, and I'm the only small trembling animal I'm ever going to be or have.
Yes.
And so, my choice is not, I think, to deny that I am the small trembling animal, but also not to try to act as if I'm something that I'm not.
No.
But to be the best, happiest, most virtuous, small trembling animal that you can be, because I don't think that we have any other choice in the matter.
No, we don't. I don't think so. And honestly, that's been kind of my personal journey too. Well, okay. This is the last question. Sure. So if you're that trembling, insightful, but endearing animal. And say you again, eclectic spacewalk. So think about kind of you're at the International Space Station or at the moon, and you're seeing the Earth, and everyone's looking up at you. what do you say, or what do you do? Do you, because I've gotten many. It's an interesting response about what people would do when the eyes of the world are on you. What would you have to say to them? Because you are a trembling animal, but at the same time, you are a trembling animal. You know.
Well, I think again, be the best small trembling animal you can be, and make the most of that. But I think sort of the underlying message of a lot of my work is sort of it's a strange combination, sort of that we're both, I think, deeply noble beings, but at the same time deeply vulnerable beings. And much of the challenge of human life, which I hope philosophy can help us, grapple with and figure out, is to how to be both of those things, right? And not sort of embrace one at the expense of the other, and that. Those who are down on earth ashamed or worried about the vulnerable part don't have to feel worry or shame. Those who are anxious about the noble part, they don't need to feel worry or shame either. Those are sort of the coexistent features of the strange human creatures that we are, and we live best when we live with both of those things. Yeah.